Heated Rivalry is a show that objectively does have hockey in it, but can that hockey actually teach you anything about the sport? And is it relevant to the story itself? Personally, I actually think that the hockey is not only incredibly relevant, it's almost a main character. And when you actually understand the context behind the hockey in this show, it makes the relationships that much better. This is part 2 of the series that I've been doing, breaking down the hockey in the romance television show Heated Rivalry. And I think it's important to really talk about the idea that sports romance has been bringing new fans to hockey for a long time. In fact, one of the things that's really interesting about Jacob Tierney developing this show is the fact that when he found it, he originally was just getting into hockey romance for himself. A friend had recommended that during lockdown he try out sports romance and specifically hockey smut, and he stumbled along the Game Changer series on his own and really enjoyed it. He hadn't at that point thought anything about actually developing the books into a television show or that it would be something that anyone would enjoy. See, Jacob Tierney had actually already been doing a lot of hockey-related content, having been a part of both Letterkenny and Shoresy, which are objectively way more bro-y takes on the concept of hockey and making that a television show. Both of those shows are incredibly good and incredibly funny, and Shoresy is pretty much completely about hockey. But the idea of bringing in a gay romance inside the world of hockey was completely different. And when Jacob found the books, he hadn't originally thought that this would be a television show, but then he read an article that talked about how much hockey romance was doing, and how romance was a billion-dollar industry that was very objectively ignored because of the fact that the audience for it is women. That's when he realized that he wanted to be the one to make this into a TV show if it was ever going to happen. And he reached out to Rachel Reed, who ironically was already a fan of Letterkenny and so was excited to hear from Jacob Tierney about the idea of optioning the books and turning them into the TV show, which is what we ultimately have now. And one of the things that I think is really important about sports romance is objectively it reaches an audience that doesn't typically get marketed to when it comes to sports, especially hockey. Sports romance books can be your gateway into enjoying sports as a whole, and I think the larger that industry becomes, the more that industry can push people into actual sports spaces. And the more that demographic changes, the more that those leagues have to adjust to actually welcome those fans in. Heated Rivalry has done this on a scale that we have never seen before, but it's something that I'm expecting we'll continue to see people try to replicate. But I will say, as someone who has not only broken down sports romances before, of how much sports you can learn from them and how much they will push you into sports themselves, and also as a big fan of hockey myself and someone who works in the sports industry, watching Heated Rivalry really surprised me as to how much hockey there really is here and how this story really just does not function without hockey. And I realized that, of course, if you didn't watch hockey at all before, you wouldn't necessarily have all of the context that's there. And I think the story functions really well even if you don't know any of that information, but also once you do know that information, it adds this extra layer to Shane and Ilya's romance as well as Scott and Kip's that just makes the show so impeccably well done and also explains why you might suddenly have this itch to actually get into hockey after the show. So in the last video that I did, we broke down episode 1 and how it sets up this romance between Shane and Ilya and how big of a deal these guys would have been coming into the league. Across that first episode, we not only have the draft, but also their junior careers, the first time that they would have met on the ice, and how much they would have been pitted against each other before they even make it into the league. Plus what that draft scene means, all of the little moments that we see in the draft itself, as well as their gym sequence, which becomes so charged as they become the only 2 people in the world that really understand exactly what the other person is going through, and how their season breaks down, how they're able to see each other, what that looks like, and how that relates to the context of hockey. I think the pilot itself sets up this insane relationship where you not only have this tension of understanding that these 2 guys are not only the best at what they do, but also going to be pitted against each other in a media circus for the rest of their careers. And sometimes they like to kiss in secret, which sets up this tension that really just boils over for the rest of the season. So if you missed episode 1, you can always go back and watch the rest of that to get the context from the pilot, but we're gonna go ahead and jump into episode 2 and everything that you can get from that. So episode 2 to me kicks off this like incredibly romantic courting section. The first time I watched it, I was obviously like, whoa, time is moving very quickly, but it's also pretty interesting when you look at how many different seasons we go through just in this very beginning section. Episode 1 ends off at the MLH Awards in the summer at the end of the 2011 season. And then we jump into the summer break of 2011, so right in between seasons, right after those MLH Awards when Ilya would have gone back to Russia and Shane would have gone home. And for me, the way I kind of viewed this was that from the end of the MLH Awards, which would have been after the 2010-2011 season, all the way through fall of 2013 when we see Ilya and Shane actually meet up at Shane's apartment. It's just texting, sexting, and courtship, but no actual meetups. And I think the timeline of this and the way that they text is so interconnected to hockey and the way their relationship works that it really actually left a little bit of a romantic touch to me in a way that I think was really well done in a quick montage. Hockey seasons in the NHL and also obviously the MLH stretch across 2 separate years, and that's because we start in October of one year and we usually end in April of the next. We have an 82 game season, so that kind of stretches from October to mid-April, and then the regular season is over and we go into the playoffs, which start mid-April and go into May. At that point, someone is going to get to hoist that Stanley Cup up, and then we're going to have the MLH awards after, and then we go on summer break. So episode 2 in that montage, we kick off with the summer break where they're still texting, and then we go through basically the 2011-2012 season and the 2012-2013 season before we actually see them meet up. But one of the things that I really love about their texting relationship and what we see in this montage, including moments on ice, is how much of their relationship is really competitive and almost kind of combative. I think Shane and Ilya's characters are so wrapped up in how competitive they would be in hockey, and their rivalry in terms of like hatred is definitely something that's put on them by the media, but there's also a level of competitiveness between the 2 best players in the league that we're being told they are. I think you have 2 players who are playing the exact same position. They both play center. They're playing in the exact same division, meaning that they have to compete with each other to actually make it to the Stanley Cup finals, and they're actively competing against each other in a scoring race. Their relationship before it even becomes romantic obviously would have constantly been thinking about the other guy. There's a level of, for both Shane and Ilya, the other guy is really the only person that's good enough to be compared to in the league. And I think sometimes you hear athletes talk about this like high level of intensity of knowing where your competitiveness stands, that at a certain point you're like competing against yourself. And up until Shane and Ilya actually start competing against each other in the World Juniors, that was most likely what their kind of competitive edge would have been. They were the best player in their hometown, the best player on their national team, and then they would have made it to juniors and played against each other, and then they start kind of trading back and forth on victories. And then that, I think, becomes this level of intrigue. There's this level of interest for both of them in this space where they finally met their match on the ice, and luckily for them, it ends up also being a match romantically. And I actually really love that we get basically 2 years of them kind of going back and forth and courting each other, but also the flirting is so tied to that competitiveness. The first time we see them on the ice, we see Shane score against Ilya, and then we see Ilya frustrated and ignoring him on the bench. Then later on in the season, we see Shane watching Ilya in the playoffs, and we see Ilya kind of taunting him. In the workout sequence, Ilya says that he's going to score 9 goals, and we all know why. And of course, we get this locker room talk about their rivalry, as well as this constant reminder from the media. And in that locker room talk, we also get a little bit of information about the fandom behind these 2 teams, which I actually think is super important to understand the stakes of the cottage later. In the spring of 2013 section, there's a Montreal-Boston game, and we're in the Montreal locker room along with Shane and his teammates. And we see his teammates really getting excited about the rivalry, about how much they want to take down Boston, how much they want to take down Ilya in general. And they talk about how the Montreal fans are burning an effigy of Ilya outside the stadium. And they also offer to show him videos of the Boston fans doing the same thing of Shane outside the Boston stadium. Now, this sounds ridiculous, but it is unfortunately really true. This is the type of thing that you definitely would see in this fandom. These 2 players who have been pitted against each other from the very beginning, are the best in the league, and are these bitter rivals, are absolutely going to have teams that have such a level of hatred for the other team and the other player that it feels almost inescapable. And I think one of the cool parts about that in this 2-year period where you're essentially seeing Shane resist the urge to actually meet up with Ilya, to hook up with Ilya, to fall any deeper into this thing that he's doing with Ilya at this time, is the fact that no matter what these 2 guys do, even though they're actually only crossing paths a couple of times a year, they literally would not be able to stop thinking about the other one even if they wanted to. Shane and Ilya are in the same division, so they would be playing each other a maximum of 4 times a year, but usually 3 to 4 is how many times you would play another team in your division during your 82 game schedule. So they basically are in the same city only 3 to 4 times throughout the regular season, and then they have the All-Star game and the MLH awards. And that kind of seems like almost a pretty easy thing to resist, right? It's sort of like that show Too Hot to Handle. It's like, okay, you can resist. You can resist 3 to 4 to 5, 6 times a year. Except for the fact that no matter how hard these 2 guys try to stop thinking about each other, this is their bitter rival that goes so far away from just the 2 of them. This is institutionalized hatred that is going to happen no matter who is in that other jersey, and it's elevated by the fact that they're in the same draft class and they're both trying to save these struggling franchises that are part of the original 6, and that they're both being viewed as these possible saviors of their franchises, which means that nonstop there is going to be a world world where they're constantly asked about the other guy, even when they're not playing each other. And so I think the other part of it that you get in this little montage that really kind of heightens the stakes to their secret relationship is that the idea of their relationship getting out on its own would be bad enough, right? The idea of them being outed in a league where there's not a single gay player out is scary enough. But the context of the two of them actually being together is even scarier because there is this institutionalized kind of hatred that is kind of the fun of sports, but is also definitely a big element of the reason why they shouldn't be together. So we build that tension for 2 seasons. In the spring of 2013, we literally have Ilya's effigy being burned outside of the stadium because of how much the fans who love Shane hate Ilya. And then we go into fall of 2013 where the dam finally breaks. Shane does an interview before the game against Boston where he's asked about the scoring race and the fact that Ilya scored a hat trick in the last game and that he's almost caught up to him in this scoring race. One thing that I'll talk about a couple of times throughout these series of videos explaining the hockey context is this idea of points and a scoring race. In the NHL, what we call points are not just the number of goals that you score, but also the number of goals that you assist on. So if you had 25 goals and 25 assists, you would have a total of 50 points in the league. Anyways, the point being, when we're talking about this scoring race, the idea that the two of them are sort of at the height of it is a big deal for things like MVP, for things like record breaking, and sort of like where these two guys stand. But it's also something that would play into their on-ice dynamic. When Shane is scoring, particularly not just the Metros, it's going to be more irritating to Ilya in terms of competition, because Shane is his direct competition when it comes to hockey, when it comes to a scoring race, when it comes to goals scored. Shane scoring is always going to be insult to injury rather than anyone else on the team scoring, and the same can be true for Ilya scoring versus Shane. In this interview, they also say that Ilya scored a hat trick at his last game, which if you don't know what a hat trick is 3 goals in the same game. It's very impressive, and after it happens, usually your fans throw their hats on the ice to celebrate. You do not get those hats back though, so if you're going to your first hockey game and you're throwing your hat on the ice, just remember that it's not going to be returned to you. Perhaps bring a spare hat if it's something that you're worried about. Ultimately, at this game, fall 2013, which would most likely be their first meeting of the season, Shane ends up taking the Metros to a win of 4-3. But the thing that I kind of found to be a really interesting version of their dynamic that also gets heightened before this game was Ilya making the move to send him these sort of racy texts before the game. The thing that I really enjoyed about this was it was sort of this moment where Ilya pushed the boundaries further than he has been over the last 2 years that we've been watching them sort of court each other, or more so Ilya court and Shane sort of like flirt but not necessarily be willing to take it to the next level. In this time, they never actually kind of crossed that line of texting before the game, which would also sort of cross this line of competitive edge. And I really actually love the way that we see into Shane's mind when he's texting Ilya back and trying to figure out what he wants to do, because we get this first text from Ilya, and in that response, we watch Shane delete 3 different versions of a response of him basically being like, "Are you trying to mess with my head before the game?" And I think that there's something really interesting in their relationship dynamic of that, because as much as they also ultimately end up falling in love with each other, they also have this element of competition that never goes away. And I think Ilya is really the one to sort of toe the line of danger each time in this relationship. We see it almost every episode. In the first episode, obviously, he's the one to sort of initiate contact, and then we also see him at the MLH Awards kiss Shane in public. It's something that stresses Shane out, and it's something that makes him push him away, but it's also something that is like really required in this moment for their relationship to move forward. Ilya toes that line again, which also I think really wraps hockey into their relationship in a way that again is inescapable. Ilya is texting him before the game, potentially throwing his mental state off, and then Shane ends up going out and playing a really good game. And he can only be but so mad because they do win that game 4-3. There's something so specific about their relationship and the way that this kind of comes together. And also the fact that Ilya kind of stepping outside of that line of like all's fair in love and war, almost pushing it too far, is the thing that makes Shane finally say like, yes, you can come over. And I think we see that dynamic immediately when Ilya actually does come inside. Shane throws him against the wall and says, "What's your problem?" I am paraphrasing to keep this video from being censored. But there's a very fun dynamic in that stairwell interaction because Shane wasn't thrown off his game. In fact, he ended up having a better game and he does still beat Ilya. And there's something still competitive in everything that they do, not just their actual on-ice relationship and the hockey relationship, but also their texting relationship and even just running up the stairs to go upstairs and hook up. Everything about their dynamic, whether it's on ice or in the bedroom, has this constant push and pull of competitiveness until one of them pushes it too close to softness, and then you see a little bit of a freak out. I think we even see that little dynamic in their teasing as they go upstairs, as they go to the bedroom, as Ilya asks about all of these different pillows, understanding the fact that these two guys, no matter how much they try to stop thinking about each other, are always going to be reminded by the media, by the fan base, by their teammates, and by their coaches of the other guy. Shane's experiences, successes, and failures are always going to be compared to Ilya's. And the same goes for Ilya. They have been put in this situation where you would love to stop thinking about this person who's too dangerous for you. But also, not only is everyone reminding you of him in what feels like every single day of the season, he's also the only one who can get into that competitive edge with you and, so to speak, sort of like meet your freak, you know? I think it's match your freak, but that's the point. The point is that I feel like for Shane especially, and also for Ilya, there's not more of a perfectly cut partner than your literal rival. And I think it creates this sort of magnetic push and pull that informs every part of their relationship in such a strong way. And then of course, when Ilya does leave that evening, we start talking about the Winter Olympics. Then again, it goes right back to teasing, right back to competitiveness, right back to trying to one up the other. One of my favorite lines from this episode actually is Ilya saying, dreaming of what, bronze medal? No, I will not be doing a Russian accent because I am not Connor Story and I don't know how to do that very quickly. I think there are just so many layers of the way that their relationship works. But the other thing that's really interesting is we head into the Olympics at Sochi in 2014, and that comes with so many layers that are kind of explored in this show. First and foremost, the Winter Olympics in 2014 in Sochi actually have a lot of lore behind them. This is the last time that the NHL allowed their athletes to participate in the Olympics, and there were a lot of conversations about the danger for athletes as well as LGBTQ athletes specifically in Russia surrounding these games heading into them. It is one of the things that I found kind of interesting about Shane and his understanding of the world around him, because he does seem sort of surprised by the information that this may not be the safest place for people who are out. If you were around for the 2014 Olympics, you probably remember that there was a really big conversation around what it would look like for athletes that were out to actually attend. And that was because Russia truly was not safe at that time for people who were out. And so it was interesting to me how much Shane really didn't understand this about Ilya and about his upbringing and also about his ability to go back home. And when we see it kind of brought up in the conversation that he has with the two American hockey players when he's actually at the Olympics, that seems to almost be the first time that he's really processing the information. And one of the things that it did kind of make me wonder is if Shane really fits into this hockey bubble so much so that Ilya also fits into that hockey bubble so well that it's really the only time he would have even thought about kind of veering off of his path. And that because of that, he doesn't really think to bring in any context of something that wouldn't already be in this hockey world. Shane has such a one-track mind, which we know partially is because the actor has said that he is on the spectrum, as has Rachel Reed, and that there is a sort of level of autism there, but also part of his kind of singular one-track mind and special interest of hockey is part of what has made him into such an incredible player. But I also think it continues to be part of his relationship dynamic with Ilya, where Ilya fits into his life so well that he almost doesn't have to learn anything separately. And at the Olympics, it's really the first time where we see Shane kind of understand something separate from his own understanding of what Ilya's life would be like. Because to some degree, Shane kind of views Ilya's life as a mirror of his own. And as we get into the Olympics, as we see Shane go to Russia for the first time and see some of these kind of experiences, and also start to understand the news a little bit more, I guess, you also start to see his understanding of Ilya crumble and a space where there might be something new for him to learn about Ilya. There's also some other interesting context that comes from the Winter Olympics here with Sochi and 2014 that I think is pretty relevant. 2014 is actually the last year that the NHL allowed their players to go to the Olympics. And part of the conversation that we saw afterwards as to why the NHL didn't want their athletes to keep going was partially this idea of the housing situation at Sochi. We kind of hear that referenced in this conversation between Shane and Scott talking about the smell in the room and if it's black mold. And it is kind of funny because obviously we know Shane has like his issues with cleanliness and things like that. And also to understand that he would have been sharing a room with two other athletes, as we're seeing Scott also do. This roommate situation, the cleanliness, the black mold smell, all of that kind of spells out a nightmare for Shane, but is also partially why the NHL didn't send players back moving forward. There were a lot of other reasons, including lost income for the league because of the Olympic break, and also like we're seeing right now in the current NHL season, there's a requirement because the Winter Olympics take place during the NHL season. The NHL has to take an Olympic winter break, which also means that their schedule has to be kind of heightened at the beginning of the season. So players are playing a lot more games a lot quicker and also traveling a lot more, which makes them more prone to injury. And so we did see that the NHL after this kind of takes a break from that. And so if you kind of follow that same timeline, it gives you a little bit more of a gut punch when you think about how Ilya's Olympics went. This is really the first time that these guys would have had a chance to play in the Olympics, but also most likely the last time that they would. Shane and Ilya still playing now actually means that they would be going to the Olympics for the first time since 2014 and 2026. And one of the interesting things about that is if you look at the actual Olympic rosters this year, on Team Canada, there are only two players that were also on the Olympic roster in 2014. 2014. Those are Sidney Crosby and Drew Doughty. Sidney Crosby plays for the Penguins and Drew Doughty plays for the LA Kings. He's a defenseman. And so the other thing that they wouldn't have known at this moment, but also kind of if you are a hockey fan, you know that already, this is really the only chance that these guys have to play for the Olympics. It's reasonable to assume that Shane and Ilya would have continued playing and would have been able to be in the Olympics again. However, currently Russia is banned from the Olympics and is not participating in 2026. Though even though I haven't read the books, I would say obviously we know that Ilya is on his path to Canadian citizenship. So maybe in my heart at these 2026 Olympics, we would see Shane and Ilya playing on Team Canada together at the Olympics. But that's, you know, that's further down the line. It's a little bit of a fantasy. Anyway, the point being, these Olympics were actually pretty important. And also Ilya having this really tough time at the 2014 Olympics does mirror what actually happened with Russia. In the real life 2014 Olympics, Canada actually won the gold medal, and Russia and the US actually didn't medal at all. Russia had a pretty terrible run, which is what we see happen in the show as well, and the US actually ended up 4th in those Olympics. The other thing that's interesting about the way that these Olympics are set up is that the Olympics, when they come to ice hockey, are actually a tournament. So in the beginning, we have what's called group play, and every country that's in the tournament is put into a specific group. Those groups then play a round robin tournament, which allows them to get seeded for the rest of the actual semifinals, quarterfinals, and the actual final games where we have the medals. And what's implied here is that Russia really falls out of the group play tournament before Shane and Ilya even meet on the ice. And so there's this added layer of their relationship and their rivalry where we're expecting both of them to go to the Olympics and really continue their rivalry from back home. And so instead what we end up seeing is Shane ends up being this perfect golden child who obviously potentially actually won gold. I do think it's interesting that we never see them get a medal and we never see it referenced moving forward, but I'm choosing to believe that we're going the same direction as the actual 2014 Olympics just because we also have this same insane thing where Russia completely fell out of them. And so what we get at the Olympics instead is almost a worse version for Ilya of what they had going into the actual MLH season. When we go back to the pilot and we look at their World Juniors record, Ilya beat Shane in the first one, then we see Shane go 2nd overall when Ilya takes 1st overall in the draft, but then at those other World Juniors, Canada and Shane win, right before they actually go into their MLH pro season career. With that, when we look at the Olympics, Shane and Ilya don't even have a chance to face off because Ilya falls so poorly out of this tournament. And he does that in front of his family. And one of the things that I would point out about Shane's understanding of Ilya's relationship is that, again, because Ilya fits so perfectly into his life that he doesn't even think about the idea that something different could be going on for him. I know a lot of people really disliked Ilya in this episode, and I was kind of shocked by it because for me, you watch Shane almost unintentionally needle at Ilya, and multiple times Ilya is like, please stop, please shut up, and also really gives a lot of signals that this is not what he wants to talk about. We see it in the stairwell where Shane is just completely blissed out and talks about how much his parents want to be at the games, but they can't come, but his mom is threatening to wake up at 4 a.m. every day to watch every single one of his games, and doesn't pick up on the fact that Ilya says that his dad will probably come to the games, maybe his brother, and doesn't mention his mom. I think also you have this space where Ilya is looking at Shane as someone who has really everything that he wants. He has supportive parents, he has teammates who really like him. He has a space where Shane could still go home. Whereas Ilya is really forcing himself to go home and trying to force himself to form fit. And as we move forward in his story, we know that there are spaces where he just will never fit, and no matter what he does for his family, he doesn't get anything back. Then when we actually get to the Olympics, we see Ilya's dad, and we know that these Olympics are taking place in Sochi. It is like the worst possible version of what could happen to Ilya on the hockey side of things. Ilya has left Russia, gone to North America, has been competing in this league and playing for Boston, has been absolutely crushing it, and of course has this narrative of coming home to represent his country, and then everything really does fall apart. And we get a lot of that context again when we see Ilya and his dad talk. Ilya's dad references the Russian league and says that going to North America has made him lazy, and I think that there's an interesting conversation about kind of the way that hockey's played in Russia versus the way that it's played in the US and in Canada, and I think the NHL versus the Russian league is this interesting conversation, but it also adds more of a dynamic about his relationship with his father. There is, of course, this desire for Ilya to stay under his thumb and to stay in a country where they're able to suck all of his money, influence, and power into their own relationships. But obviously, Ilya is also using hockey as an escape. But I think there's also this defensiveness. Ilya truly believes that he is a better hockey player than he's ever been, and frankly, he probably is. Ilya's brought an Original Six team into the playoffs multiple times. He's leading his Olympic team at a young age. And of course, we see him become captain of his team. He is competing at the height of the league. He is one of the star players there, and it's not his fault that the Russian team just falls apart. I think there's an interesting conversation about sports as an escape, about kind of potentially finding a new home elsewhere once you bring that level of experience to that space. And also, of course, this almost demonic version of his family that is just sucking him dry. And I will say that this whole sequence with Ilya's dad, with the party, with Svetlana, with the Olympics themselves, I was shocked to see people feel like Ilya was this horrible person in this relationship. This obviously is less of a hockey analysis and just a like personal character analysis, but I think sometimes people have a hard time understanding characters who actually have real trauma in their lives and how hard it is for them to relate to people who don't have that same level of trauma. Shane has things that are troublesome in his life for sure, but Shane doesn't have this same level of intensity in terms of the trauma that he grew up with. Shane views hockey as something that he really loves, that he's really good at, and that yes, sometimes is stressful. Ilya's hockey is really a lifeline. It is the thing that keeps him away from this space that we're watching him live in this episode. And it is the only thing that allows him to leave Russia for the periods of times that he does. It is also the thing that keeps him connected to his family as they continue to suck him dry when it comes to the money. And all those things spell out his relationship with hockey in a way that Shane just genuinely doesn't understand. There is an argument to be said that Ilya is not necessarily opening up and explaining those things, but there's also an argument to be said that there's really not that level of trust in their relationship yet. And of course, the level of danger that there is in Russia for Ilya specifically. At that party that we see Ilya in, we also see them reference this player who decided to stay home to compete for American prizes. This sort of implied that there was another character or another player that would have been on the Russian international team that decided not to go to the Olympics because he wanted to focus on his NHL season, which is kind of the thing that we're talking about here with this Olympic break and the amount of intensity that changes the season when they have to take time off. I thought this was an interesting point where we know that there was sort of issues with the Russian team, but we hear Ilya's dad harp on this idea of lack of leadership, which of course is a dig at Ilya directly. But then we do get this really big dump of hockey context from Svetlana, and I will say it was one of my favorite parts of this episode. Personally, I really love Svetlana. I know we don't ever see this actress speak in English, but I think that's even more impressive. We get so much context from her, so much excitement, and also so much hockey knowledge that I'm obsessed with her. Honestly, Svetlana gives this energy of like, if the women's league had been at a place where she could have been a professional hockey player, she would have dominated everyone. I love Svetlana, and I see something about her in myself that is I love her. But the point being is we see Svetlana rescue Ilya from this conversation with his father and with her father, who we later find out is also a kind of famous goalie. So they go into this luxurious bathroom, and of course the surprise is Ilya's former flame. But in that conversation, Svetlana very quickly breaks down like all of the hockey we saw in the Olympics and also the rest of this season. She says that Ilya has a chance to win the cup this season, and that's because of this incredible breakdown that she does in like 3 seconds. Scott Hunter and the Admirals won't get past New Jersey. New Jersey won't get past Montreal, and you can beat Montreal because they have a hurt goalie. In this, she's breaking down the sort of path that Ilya would have to get past with the Boston Raiders to be able to get through the Eastern Conference to make it to the finals, which also gives us this reminder that Scott Hunter really fits into their space in a very specific way. And that's also why we see them go up against each other. Even though they're not these bitter rivals, they are sort of against each other frequently. And so Scott Hunter is this other big name that would have been in their conference before they both got into the league. And so there's an interesting kind of space where we see Scott kind of set up as someone whose star would be waning a little bit as Ilya and Shane's star starts to rise. Of course, we know nothing about New Jersey, about their team, and how everything's working out in this show, so we just have to assume that, like, in real life, they're not doing very well. With this speech that we have from Svetlana, I do love how much they compress hockey and, like, the actual path that they would have to take to the finals in. Not only does she go down the Eastern Conference, she then explains the Western Conference. So if you've never watched hockey before, essentially the way everything works is that we have 32 teams in the league, and both of those are split into conferences, East and West. There are 16 teams in both of those conferences, and then under those conferences, we have divisions. In your division, you play each team 3 to 4 times in a regular season, and of course, you play teams in the rest of the league as well. You earn points for every game. Those points come together and are added out throughout the season. And at the end of the regular season, you're ranked based off of how many points that you've earned for your regular season schedule. Those points then determine who gets into the playoffs, and they also set the brackets. So then when we go into the playoffs, the Eastern Conference has their own bracket, and the Western Conference has their own bracket, and the team that wins the Western Conference and the team that wins the Eastern Conference square off for the Stanley Cup Finals. Playoffs are also a best of 7 every round, so each team needs to win 4 games. So essentially, Svetlana starts out by laying out the best of the Eastern Conference, who Ilya and the Boston Raiders have to be better than to actually win their Eastern Conference. Then on the Western Conference, she jumps ahead and says that it will definitely be San Francisco, implying that that team is the best on the Western Conference and that no one will be able to stand in their way. However, she says that San Francisco can definitely be beat because they're a very young team. Ilya at this point has been running running with the Boston Raiders for quite a long time. And of course, in her mind, has a better kind of team lineup to be able to beat this young but very fast team. I love how much information they not only drop here, but also how much color this gives Ilya's relationship with Svetlana. This conversation, I feel like, really shows why Ilya feels so comfortable with her. Not only have they grown up with each other, but they also have this shared obsession with hockey. And she also really does probably get as close as possible to his relationship with Shane. Svetlana, of course, as we talk about multiple times throughout this show, really makes sense to Ilya on paper. They grew up together. Svetlana understands everything about his relationship with his family. She also really has this large investment in hockey, and especially has this relationship with her father that allows her to have grown up around hockey. And she completely understands everything about Ilya's experience, whether she's kind of talking to him about it or not. She's heavily invested. She watches all of his games. She understands everything going on in the league at all times. And it makes sense why they make sense. I really love how much she's built up in this show and sort of how much she fulfills that role. And also some of these moments where we see how much she understands about what's important to Ilya really set up a more emotional payoff for the bigger moments later on when she reveals that she knows who Shane is. I think a lot of that works really well and gets set up really well in this moment, and also functions again with hockey as this main character and as this sort of color for relationship ties. Svetlana's relationship to hockey colors her relationship with Ilya in such a strong way, where it is this level of I see you and I understand you, and also here's your best path to success. I also think when she leaves him alone with Sasha, we also get this understanding of Ilya's kind of concern about danger, especially in Russia. Ilya has now grown up, and we get this conversation from Sasha saying, you used to like danger, you used to have fun. And I think we also see Ilya push that away, and there's a concern about it. And I think also when we see him not respond to Shane's text but look at it again at the end of this scene, there's almost a level of him not wanting to bring danger into his relationship with Shane in this specific way. Danger in sort of flirting on a rooftop or kind of kissing your rival is one thing, but real danger in his home country where he really understands what's at stake seems to kind of be off the table for Ilya now. One thing I almost wish we did have in this episode was Ilya having to watch Shane get a gold medal. I think it obviously would have been a tough watch, especially for Ilya, but I also think it would have been this mirroring moment where we get to see his reaction in kind of a public space, where we get to see Shane later watch Ilya hoist the cup up, and of course in later episodes Ilya watch Shane do the same. I'm sure there are production reasons or story reasons why we didn't do this, and obviously it could have just been for time, but I do kind of wish that we had gotten to see it. Obviously after the Olympics things are not in a great place with our boys, but we move on to spring of 2014. At this point, for hockey context, we do jump over quite a bit of the season. Essentially the Olympics happen in February, and they would have gone back to the rest of their regular season, so March and mid-April, and then when we pick back up, we were watching Shane watch the Stanley Cup finals. So we're in May at this point. A few things that I think are interesting hockey context-wise that they drop in here. We're watching game 6 of the finals, which are happening in Boston, which actually means that Boston would not have had the better record over San Francisco for the regular season. The way that home ice advantage works in the Stanley Cup finals is that the team with the better seed based off of their regular season record, so before the playoffs, gets home ice advantage for more games. And the way that the travel schedule works is that the first 2 games are played at the better team's arena. So the first 2 games of this series would have been played in San Francisco. Then the next 2 games are played at the other team, so that would have been in Boston. Game 5 would have been played in San Francisco, and now game 6, which we're watching, is being played in Boston. So that means that Boston would have won at least 1 game on the road during this series, and that it's probably a pretty tough fought battle. Because this is a best of 7, you have to win 4 games, so they would have been sitting at a situation where it's 3-2. And we get this epic speech from Ilya in the locker room, which frankly I really loved. I thought it showed so much of Ilya's energy when it came to hockey, and I also think it shows how much respect he's gotten in the locker room at this point. One thing I did want to mention is that at this point in their careers, both Shane and Ilya have become captains. And I did get a couple of questions about whether or not that timeline was legitimate or accurate, and the answer is yes. With the way that these guys are playing and the level of stardom that they have, they would be very young captains, but it also is completely legitimate that they would be captains at this point. Quinn Hughes, for example, was quite a young captain at the Vancouver Canucks before they traded him away, and a number of other players have become captain very young because of the level of stardom and records that they have. So I love seeing Ilya in his space, in his element, and at this high level of leadership, especially after that's exactly what has been criticized about him at the Olympics by his father. I will be honest with you and tell you that I have an edit of this speech downloaded on my phone that I continually watch every morning when I need to get hyped up. I think that this speech is so well done. It's very fun. Obviously, I've never been in an NHL locker room, but I think it brings in that intensity of sports in a show that otherwise does continue to have a lot of masculinity, but is actually quite soft in terms of like the relationships, the interactions that they have. I think there's something very fun about seeing Ilya at this high level of intensity where like spit is coming out of his mouth and he's shouting, and the rest of his team is really rallying around him and hyping him up. And I wonder how many times those speeches before this, like when he's playing playing against Montreal, how many times his speeches would reference specifically Shane. There are so many little things that we get here, so many little moments that really color the way that Ilya interacts with the rest of his team. And the fact that we also in this same episode get this exact split between the way that he behaves in Russia and the way that he's welcomed and not welcomed there, and the way that he fits as this leader and star in Boston. Again, I think these moments that we get where we see how intense and how important he is to the franchise and to the city color this idea of him eventually agreeing to leave all of that behind to go to Ottawa for Shane. So much of his love for Shane involves actually sacrificing his kind of safety in hockey and his element of what he's built for himself. And we're watching really the culmination of everything he has built for himself in this moment in Boston. So that's a long-winded way of saying that I think that this speech shows you how much in his element and how much Boston has become home, even if Ilya doesn't realize it himself, and really how much of this legacy he would be giving up by leaving. And then of course we do watch him win the cup alongside Shane with the rest of his teammates. A couple of things that happen in this sequence that I think are very fun. One, we do know that Svetlana was completely correct in all of her predictions. The Montreal Metro's goalie was in fact hurt, and that's the guy just sitting complaining about getting his playoff beard shaved now that the playoffs are over. The playoff beard is absolutely a thing. Every player kind of starts to attempt to grow out a beard, whether they can or not, and they don't cut it until the playoffs are over. I do like the small chirp that we get about how Shane can't grow a beard, but there is another very fun kind of hockey tradition that gets put into this space. We also know that Svetlana was right about San Francisco making it to the cup, and of course that she was right that Boston would actually win this year. There are a couple of things that get said in the voiceover that I honestly think must have just been filler and not really like thought through. There's this run where they talk about how Ilya had this incredible series. They say he scored 10 goals in the last 6 playoff games, which is not unreasonable to say and definitely would be impressive. But they also say that he led the team in block shots and goals against, which is kind of weird phrasing and also a little odd. Ilya plays center, so he wouldn't necessarily be playing defense and blocking a lot of shots. And I think goals against just means goal scored. Again, this is like so nitpicky to just point it out, but it's just the only thing that's hockey related in this one space. The intent behind it is obviously that Ilya did very good and he won the cup. It's such an emotional moment that you can let it go. And also I had to watch it like multiple times and turn the subtitles on to actually get everything that they were saying about his stats. So I guess maybe moving forward we could hope for better stats, but again, I don't think it's so dramatic. I think a lot of the stats that are thrown up in this show, sometimes they're not right, sometimes they don't make sense, but the goal and the intent behind them makes sense to me, which is Ilya's very good at hockey. And of course we get Shane watching him win the cup and kind of again reiterating how much his rivalry is there. We have Hayden Pike say that he hates Ilya the most, and also we get Shane with his classic held back tears watching Ilya win the cup with like real pride in his eyes. And I do think that it's the most heartbreaking but also heartwarming moment at the same time. Everything about their relationship is of course in secret, even being able to celebrate and be jealous of each other's successes. But then of course we go to the MLH Awards where Shane is finally seeing Ilya after Ilya has been ignoring Shane since February. This is pretty quick. Obviously we have the two of them presenting an award together for sportsmanship, which I do think is hilarious, and so would the writers of the awards. And of course they kind of settle right back into their competitive push and pull, which I think is really great. One of the things about the hotel room scene that I think is so psychotic on Ilya's part but also just fits into their relationship so well is, do you want to know how it feels holding the cup? Again, we jump into this space where Shane suddenly is so comfortable with Ilya because of that competitive space. They're constantly crossing lines, they're constantly pushing each other and pushing each other away, and also they're like getting right up to the edge of this competitive spirit. I think again you have these moments where their relationship does not exist without hockey, and hockey is so core to their relationship to that it's almost a third person. Obviously this episode ends in a very upsetting way with the "we didn't even kiss," but I think when we go through the entirety of episode 2, what we get is this idea of how much of their relationship, how much of their flirting is tied to their actual rivalry in a real way. I love how much of that rivalry is actually so important to the building of their relationship itself and the context that you get in every single moment that they meet, either on ice or off, either in North America or in Russia, or at the awards and in the bedroom. Their rivalry, their competition, it is constantly present in this space. And it's almost part of what attracts them to each other. I'm gonna get rid of the almost, like it is definitely part of what makes each of these guys attracted to the other one. Shane is also in this space where he's just lost MVP and he watched Ilya win the cup. And that informs their relationship. That gives them this space where they're continuing to push each other further. And I do think that that dynamic is so intense, and it's also so good because it's part of what we've been talking about this show in general, which is that they are completely equal in a way that is really, really, really difficult to do in romance in general. And I think their rivalry is absolutely core to making that part of their relationship possible. So that takes us through pretty much all of episode 2. Last episode was about episode 1 if you want to go back to that. But what I really love about episode 2 across this way is that we see the ways that that the hockey relationship and the rivalry relationship, especially early on, is really affecting their relationship both in a positive and negative way. I think so much about their rivalry and also this stretch of time at the beginning where they're trying to kind of quit each other really shows how their rivalry is also part of why they can't quit each other. I really love how we see in this episode that their relationship sort of enhances the more that their rivalry kind of gets bigger. Of course, we have these moments in the locker room and in press where it's constantly being referenced. And of course, we also have this expectation of success against each other, which means that every time they fail, this person is a part of it. And I think that they bring all of that into their romantic relationship as well. And we even see them kind of get a little bit more playful with each other in the bedroom in a way that their rivalry is consistently brought back up. And I think this is one of the things that is so well done about this show. For me, when you put a romance in a setting of sports, it's really important that the sport itself is relevant to that story. I think a good sports romance means that if you took it out of that sport, it wouldn't work in the same way. And I think Heated Rivalry actually really does that so well in a way that a lot of times sports romance doesn't do. I think that idea of setting as character is actually really just a hallmark of all good writing, not necessarily just writing when it comes to sports romances. For example, when you set a movie or TV show in Boston, that same story shouldn't work exactly the same if it moves to LA. And a show set in LA shouldn't work the same way if we move it to Italy. Setting as character is really important and it should influence the story. And when you come into a sports story, I think it's even more so the case. And one of the things that I think Heated Rivalry does even better than just the basics is that not only does this story have to take place in sports for it to work, if you took it to a different sport, it would not work in the same way. Shane and Ilya in the NFL or the NBA is completely different than Shane and Ilya in hockey. And I think hockey in their relationship as it kind of weaves together is really important and really interesting. And I think episode 2 in particular does a really good job of showing how that rivalry and that competitive edge also makes a part of why they're so attracted to each other and why they can't step away, which is something that then continues to grow over the rest of the episodes. Before we end, I did want to kind of go through a couple of the comments that were left on the last episode because I think a lot of good points were made that I didn't cover. One thing that came up a lot was in the conversation about Ilya and kind of the pressure that he feels in the press conference. A lot of people referenced the fact that Ilya would also be trying to deal with the language barrier here and that he would be a bit jealous of Shane and his ability to deal with this not only in one language but in two. I will say I only just started reading the book and I wanted to go through the television show as its own thing. So things that we're only understanding from the television show because there are some changes that I've already seen and obviously the television show doesn't have the same deal of being able to give you these guys' internal monologue. You can probably see in my background I'm like halfway through if you can see my bookmark here. And I do think that the idea of Ilya's English is a little bit more highlighted in the book than it is in the television show. But I also think one of the relevant points that I did leave out in terms of like the hockey of it all is the fact that Shane speaks fluent English and French, and that would be a huge deal in Montreal. There's a lot of respect across sports, not just in the NHL, when an athlete is able to speak that home language of their team. French is a language that is very important in Montreal specifically. And so the fact that Shane is able to interview in both English and French and answer those questions is a really big deal. A good example of this is also when we saw Francois Arnaud go to a game and was actually interviewed in French. And when you look at other sports, so like for example, in F1, you have Ferrari. Charles Leclerc speaks Italian even though he is from Monaco. And so he speaks English, French, and Italian and is able to interview in all of those different ways, which makes things very cool, but also is a really big deal to Italian fans. Lewis Hamilton himself is learning how to speak Italian as well. And so you have this element of trying to learn the language of your fans specifically. And when you do, it's obviously a very big deal. For Shane, we know he grew up in Canada, so it may not have been something he learned specifically for the team, but something that he grew up with. But regardless of why he learned French, it would be a huge deal that he is fluent enough to actually interview in that language. And of course, that would be something that Ilya again feels very jealous of. And in that moment, we see him when he's in the hotel room watching Shane give that interview, and he complains in Russian about the fact that Shane is able to be so perfect in French. So I do think while it's not as highlighted as much in the book, of course, Ilya is dealing with this ability to kind of translate and learn English as he also becomes a huge star in America. And of course, it's one of those things that on paper, Shane is beating him at. So I am glad that people pointed this out in the comments because I do think it is a really relevant point here. And one other thing that was made out in the comments that I thought was relevant too was this idea of Yuna and her Canadianness. A lot of people pointed out that I assumed that it was by marriage, which is true. I do think the show doesn't really tell you when she became a Canadian citizen, but it is totally possible that it was not through marriage to David and also that she immigrated as a kid. Also, a lot of people have pointed out that that again is potentially mentioned in the books. Again, I haven't finished it yet, but I think either way, regardless of where that space comes from, the point still stands that Yuna is looking at hockey as a way of feeling in place when she is an outsider. And even if she was born and raised in Canada, this is still a space where she is finding her identity in hockey rather than in the space around her. And I think that there's something really relevant to that regardless of when it was. Ironically, I actually think it would be even more interesting if it was because she was a kid and they moved to Canada, or maybe she's first generation. All of those possibilities are super relevant to her concept of identity. At some point, she did not feel Canadian, she felt as an outsider. And hockey, and being a Montreal Metros fan in particular, allowed her to become part of that space. So regardless of what that identity was or when that time happened, I think there's something really interesting in Yuna as an outsider becoming an insider because of hockey knowledge. And especially when you look at how much more she knows about hockey than her husband, who also played hockey for McGill and obviously had some sort of level of interest in hockey itself. Hockey as belonging is such a really good theme in this show, specifically between Yuna and Ilya's characters, and I'm super interested to see as we move forward into season 2 what that relationship looks like between the two of them, because it is something that you could see sort of a moment to relate with. And I also think it's important to recognize how big of a deal hockey and fandom is, and especially loyalty is, to Yuna when we get into episode 6 and we talk about what she represents in this space. Most importantly, throughout the whole first season, Yuna actually really represents what a real hockey fan would look like in reaction to Shane and Ilya's relationship. And I think it's interesting when you keep those things in mind and you kind of use this motherly character for Shane as a relevant touch point of what he's so afraid of with everyone finding out. But I do think the idea of when Yuna became a Canadian citizen was a really relevant point, so I did want to talk about that a little bit here. So I hope you enjoyed episode 2. If you haven't watched episode 1, definitely turn around and watch that. And also the next video we'll go through episode 3, which of course is a totally different relationship, Scott and Kip. And I'm really excited to break down how hockey goes into their relationship there because it's a totally different dynamic. You have Scott as a very well-known hockey player, and you have Kip who kind of doesn't know who this guy is. And I think there's something really interesting about Scott and Kip's relationship and how hockey hampers it in a way that's very different from Shane and Ilya. So if you've been enjoying these breakdowns, be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss episode 3. And of course, let me know if you have any questions about what I talked about now or comments that you want me to address in the next episode. And if you're just getting into sports and this was your first gateway into them, this channel is all about breaking things down in a way that is friendly, fun, and accessible to new fans. So be sure to subscribe and let me know any other questions that you have in the comments down below.